Hello, my cripplingly, devastatingly autistic fanbase. Recently, I made some tweets, go follow my Twitter by the way, at FakeTaxPress, making fun of new episodes of The Simpsons for being bad. And by bad, I don't mean like, oh, the show fell off. I mean like, it's insultingly terrible. It is the television equivalent of being waterboarded. It is anti-entertainment. It makes you less happy than you were before you watched it. Scientists should study new Simpsons episodes as a potential treatment for serotonin overdoses. It's like that bad. It is bad, guys. The show really hasn't been good since at least season 15, and honestly, I think the real cutoff is even earlier than that. See, my personal theory on why it fell off so hard is that The Simpsons gradually became the Lisa Simpson show, and over time the writing staff was replaced almost entirely by the exact kind of person that Lisa's character was originally created to satirize. Old Simpsons was written by Bart's. New Simpsons is written by Lisa's. Lisa was supposed to be the joke of the show, the precocious 8-year-old who lectures everyone about the environment and veganism and social justice. That wasn't meant to be like something to aim for, it was something to make fun of. She was the well-meaning but insufferable liberal character that the show used to make fun of sanctimonious coastal progressives. That was the point of her character. And then over time, the writer's room filled up with actual Lisas, and suddenly, she wasn't the joke anymore, she was the author, and as such, the show went from laughing at Lisa's worldview to being written by people who share it, and, so they lost the satirical edge, because the satirists became the thing that they were satirizing. But anyway, I digress, because that's not what this video is about. What this video is about is something far more interesting, because someone commented under one of those tweets, joking, making a little joke, that The Simpsons must be a money laundering scheme at this point. Good joke. Everybody laugh. Roll on snare drum. Curtains. And normally I'd move on, but I didn't, because this comment burrowed into my brain like a parasite, right? Like fucking RFK Jr.'s brainworm. And I started thinking about it. Does The Simpsons continue to exist primarily as a means of money laundering? What if that actually is why the show is still on the air? And so I looked into it, and there is significantly more evidence for this theory than I expected there to be. Like, I went into this expecting to make a funny 5-minute video shitpost, and I came out the other side of my research crusade a little bit unsettled actually, so let's dive right into it. Now, before we get into the weeds here, let me give you a quick primer on how money laundering actually works, because I think most people's understanding of it comes from Breaking Bad, when Saul Goodman described it to Walter, and that's not quite sufficient for what we're about to discuss here. You see, money laundering has 3 phases: placement, layering, and integration. Placement is where you introduce dirty money or money that you want hidden into a legitimate business or financial system. Layering is then when you move that money through a complex series of transactions, shell companies, subsidiaries, financial instruments, and all that shit to obscure its origin. And then integration is where the now clean money re-enters the legitimate economy as apparently normal business revenue or assets. And this is relevant, because when you look at the corporate structure surrounding The Simpsons, what you find is a system that maps onto those 3 phases with an almost suspicious degree of congruence. We really ought to start with the most basic question here though, which is, why does this show still exist? And this is really a much harder question to answer than you might think. The Simpsons currently costs somewhere between $5 and $7 million per episode to produce. That is an enormous amount of money. For reference, that's more than most cable dramas cost. And those are shows with live actors, sets, locations, costumes, the whole fucking thing. The Simpsons is drawings of a yellow family in a fictional town of Springfield, and it costs $7 million an episode. And sure, animation is expensive, but Invincible, for reference, is running $2.5 million an episode, and The Simpsons is not looking like the Conquest fight scene all the way through here, Now, you could justify that cost if the show was pulling the kind of numbers that it used to. At its peak in the early 90s, The Simpsons was regularly pulling 20 to 30 million viewers per episode. The season 4 premiere in 1992 drew 28 million viewers, and that's fucking insane. That's Super Bowl numbers, right? So the show at the time was a cultural phenomenon. It was the biggest thing on television, a merchandising juggernaut that moved billions of dollars in merchandise in its first year of existence alone. But today, the show's linear viewership has fallen by roughly 90% from its peak. Recent seasons are pulling maybe 2 to 3 million viewers on a really good night, often less. And I doubt even those numbers, right, the ones they're putting out. And these are numbers that would get most shows canceled within a season. Shows with far better ratings have been axed. Shows that cost a fraction of what The Simpsons cost to produce have been canceled for pulling these exact numbers. So, that raises the question, why is The Simpsons still on the air? The standard answer is that the brand is valuable. And that's true. The Simpsons catalog, the library of 750 plus episodes, is enormously valuable as streaming content. Disney paid a huge premium for it when they acquired 21st Century Fox's entertainment assets in 2019 as part of the $70 billion deal they made. The Simpsons is one of the crown jewels of Disney+. The back catalog generates a lot of streaming revenue from intellectual property cucks who don't endorse piracy like Buccaneer deities do. But that's the back catalog. Realistically, people aren't buying Disney Plus to see new episodes of The Simpsons. They want the classics, that's what they're watching, right? So you don't need to produce new episodes to maintain a catalog. Seinfeld isn't making new episodes, Friends isn't making any new episodes, right? And those catalogs are still worth billions. What you just need to have is a catalog, and then you license it, you stream it, and you collect the checks from it. Unless, of course, you are contractually obligated to keep producing new episodes. And this is kind of where things get interesting. In 1993, The Simpsons creator Matt Groening and producer James L. Brooks negotiated a deal through their production company Gracie Films that is, by Hollywood standards, pretty unusual. The specific details of this contract are not fully public. Obviously, these things never really are, but the widely reported understanding within the industry is that the deal included provisions that chained the catalog rights to the continued production of new primetime episodes. In other words, the massive library of classic Simpsons episodes, the episodes that are actually good and that people actually want to watch, can only remain active and under corporate control if new episodes keep being produced. If they stop making new episodes, then the contractual framework around the catalog gets complicated. Rights might revert, licensing terms might change, and so Disney would lose some degree of control over the proverbial golden goose. And so, as a result, you have a situation where a company is spending $5 to $7 million per episode on content that almost nobody watches, not because the content itself is profitable, but because producing that content is the key that keeps a multi-billion-dollar vault locked and under their control. And you could rightfully point out they're still massively overpaying per episode, and they could rightfully fire back that runaway production cost is normal in Hollywood because Hollywood is staffed by the most brain-dead people out there, and they don't know how to keep costs down. And so that, in money laundering terms, is placement. You're generating massive, justifiable expenditures. $5 to $7 million an episode, 20-something episodes a season. You're looking at over $100 million a year in production costs. And you have a completely legitimate business reason for those expenditures that doesn't require the expenditures themselves to be profitable. The new episodes are loss leaders that protect the real asset. And because they're loss leaders, nobody questions why the math won't add up, because everyone knows the math isn't going to add up. The show losing money on new episodes is an open secret. It's already priced in. It's understood. And as a result of it being this kind of unquestioned expense, it becomes basically the perfect cover here. You see, Hollywood accounting is one of the great scams of the modern financial world. And I don't mean scam colloquially, I mean it in like the forensic sense of the word, that this stuff is probably technically illegal, but they're able to pull it off anyway. You see, when a studio produces a show or a movie, that show or movie generates revenue. But instead of that revenue flowing directly to the production and being reported as profit, it tends to get routed through a labyrinth of subsidiary corporations, each of which charge the production various fees. Distribution fees, marketing overhead, interest charges on production financing, administrative costs, consulting fees, shit like that. And generally, these subsidiaries are owned by the same parent company that owns the production itself. So what's happening is that the parent company is paying itself through its own subsidiaries. Revenue comes in from The Simpsons. That revenue then passes through subsidiary A, which charges some sizable distribution fee, then through subsidiary B, which might charge like marketing overhead or something, then through subsidiary C, which will charge interest on a production loan or something along those lines. And the point is that by the time the revenue is passed through all of these internally owned toll booths, the reported net profit of The Simpsons on paper is zero, or negative. And so often these shows, on paper, never make any net profit whatsoever. And I'm not speculating here, this isn't me being like a schizo god who hasn't taken his meds. This is pretty well documented stuff. It's been litigated, and it is broadly well-known Hollywood accounting practice. It is why the writers and creators of massively successful properties routinely get screwed on their net profit participation deals, because net profits in Hollywood accounting really don't exist. They're basically engineered out of existence by self-directed fees between related corporate entities. And the original creators of major hit shows have talked about this publicly. There have been lawsuits over exactly this mechanism. It is an open secret in the entertainment industry that net profit participation is a euphemism for you get diddly over squat. Now, what do you reckon this means in the context of money laundering? You have billions of dollars in revenue flowing between corporate entities. At each and every stage, you have fees being charged, capital moved around, and so you end up with this really obtuse and complicated paper trail, where by the end of the process, the taxable profit has been reduced to nothing, and the actual money is distributed across a web of subsidiaries in multiple jurisdictions. And if you're looking at this from the money laundering perspective, that looks a lot like layering. In fact, I'd say that's textbook layering. Whether or not the intent is money laundering, the mechanism is identical to what you would see in it. And then this brings us to the international dimension, which is where this theory goes from being, kind of interesting, to, I think, being actually kind of compelling. The Simpsons, like the vast majority of American animated television, outsources its labor-intensive animation work overseas. The storyboarding, voice acting, creative direction, all that shit, it happens domestically. But the actual frame-by-frame animation, right, like the drawings, the coloring, the in-betweening, all of that will get sent to studios in South Korea and China and whatever. Now, this is standard practice in the animation industry. It's been done since the 80s. Virtually every animated show you watched growing up, assuming you're not some unk watching my schizophrenic YouTube slop, was probably drawn by like Korean animators, little squinty-eyed guys. And there's nothing inherently scandalous about that. They're good artists, what can you say, right? What is kind of scandalous, and what there have been multiple reports and a significant data leak revealing, is that some of these overseas intermediary studios have subcontracted work to SDK Studio in Pyongyang, North Korea. SDK Studio, the Scientific and Educational Korea Studio, is a state-owned enterprise of the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea, meaning it's illegal under US law to do business with this entity. They are on the sanctions list. And yet, multiple investigations have found that Western animation work, including work connected to major American productions, has been funneled to SDK Studio through chains of intermediary companies. The way it works is the American studio contracts with the South Korean studio, and the South Korean studio will subcontract some work to a Chinese company, and the Chinese company will subcontract to the SDK studio in Pyongyang. Now, each link in that chain provides plausible deniability. The American studio can say that they contracted a legitimate South Korean company, and the South Korean company can say they subcontracted a legitimate Chinese company if such a thing exists. And the Chinese company is the one actually dealing with North Korea, and the Chinese don't really have to say anything at all because, Xi Jinping is their pimp, and he lets them have a really, really long leash, so fucking good luck getting Chinese regulatory authorities to enforce American sanctions over there, And the FBI has been involved in investigations regarding this, so, the whole connection between Western animated pipelines and North Korean state labor has been documented pretty thoroughly by researchers. It's been documented by journalists, the US government itself in some cases. And then that raises the question of, is there confirmed evidence that this specific pipeline has been used for The Simpsons? And that's harder to prove definitively. The animation outsourcing chain is opaque by design, which is a large part of what makes me wonder if there is laundering going on here. What we do know is that these structural conditions are there. The Simpsons outsources its animation overseas through exactly the type of intermediary chain that has been documented as a conduit for North Korean labor. And the sheer volume of capital flowing through this pipeline, over $100 million a year in production cost, which again is a staggering amount of money for an animated show, makes it an enormously attractive vehicle for what's called trade-based money laundering. You see, TBML is when you use international trade transactions to move value across borders. You over-invoice or under-invoice goods and services, and you route payments through intermediary companies, and use the sort of inherent and unavoidable complexity of international trade, which is present because of the ridiculous socialistic trade restrictions imposed by various governments, to then obscure the movement of money. It is one of the hardest forms of money laundering to detect, because it's hidden within some actually legitimate trade flows that tend to by their nature be really, really hard to audit. And so, if you have an animation production that routes millions of dollars through nested subsidiaries in multiple countries, with limited transparency about where the actual labor is performed, that's sort of a TBML operator's wet dream. Whether or not anyone's actually using it that way is an open question, but the infrastructure is there, it's ready to go. It is the corporate crime equivalent to having a car parked outside a bank with the engine running. Is it a getaway car? Nobody can say for sure, but if you wanted a getaway car, that's exactly what you'd want, right? So I don't know if this is money laundering, but it looks like what money laundering would look like. Like Gracie Films, the production company that writes and produces The Simpsons, if you can call what goes into the modern Simpsons writing, is run by James L. Brooks. Gracie Films is physically headquartered on the Sony Pictures lot in Culver City. It's not on the Fox lot or the Disney lot, but with Sony on a rival studios lot, under an indefinite facilities deal. So the company that produces The Simpsons for Disney, which acquired it from Fox, is physically and administratively located on the lot of Sony, which is a competitor to both Fox and Disney. And Gracie Films operates with apparently a great deal of creative autonomy, so the show's day-to-day operations are pretty insulated from direct corporate oversight by this arrangement. And then meanwhile you have Fox and now Disney, and then they serve as the broadcasting and distribution entity, and they're the ones who air the show and license it and obviously also stream it, and they're also the legitimate legal target for any broadcasting-related litigation. And so again, the whole point is that you have this fragmentation, where the creative entity is housed at a different studio than the broadcasting entity, which is different from the entity that owns the catalog rights, which is different from the entities that handle international distribution. It all creates this multi-jurisdictional, multi-entity corporate architecture that is, intentionally or not, and I don't know if it is intentional or not, but it is all extremely difficult to audit comprehensively. And this kind of fragmented corporate structure is exactly what forensic accountants and regulatory investigators describe as a red flag for financial fraud. When you cannot easily trace the amounts of money, going from one end of the operation to the other because it passed through a bunch of different entities in multiple different jurisdictions, that's when the evil fucking glowies in the IRS start getting suspicious of you. That's when their little glowy alarms go off, okay? And this wouldn't be unprecedented either, by the way. We have a case study here. You see, in 2014, a former executive producer of The Simpsons, one David Pritchard, was indicted by the federal government for wire fraud and securities violations. The scheme apparently worked like this. The executive set up what appeared to be a legitimate animation company. This company solicited investor capital, ostensibly to produce animated content, but instead of using the money for actual animation production, the executive systematically diverted roughly 95% of investor capital into personal executive salaries and artificial overhead costs and phantom expenses. The investors' money was being consumed by the company's own operating costs, which were inflated to astronomical levels specifically to drain the funds. 95% of investor money went to salaries and overhead. So only 5% of the money going into this studio actually went to actual production. And the guy doing this was connected to The Simpsons pretty intimately. He was a person who had been an executive producer on The Simpsons, and he used a pretextual animation company to commit wire fraud. The mechanism was artificial overhead and self-directed fees. And again, that is exactly the mechanism we described earlier in the Hollywood accounting section. So undeniably, the precedent for this does exist. And the mechanism exists, and the opportunity exists, and the infrastructure exists. The only question is whether anyone is currently exploiting this. So am I saying it is happening? I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is the conditions are perfect for it to happen. The infrastructure is there, the opacity in the system is there, the international complexity is fucking more than present. What you have to realize is that what you have here isn't fucking Homer Simpson funny yellow man Marge. What you have here is a show that cost over $100 million a year to produce for an audience that has declined by 90%. Right? The show only continues to exist, not because of its commercial viability, but because of a contractual requirement tied to a multi-billion-dollar catalog. The production budgets are subjected to Hollywood accounting practices that tend to reduce reported profits to somewhere around zero through self-directed fees between related corporate entities. The animation labor is outsourced through an international chain of intermediaries that has documented connections to sanctioned North Korean state enterprises. The corporate structure is fragmented across multiple entities and jurisdictions in a way that could serve as a paragon of red flags for financial fraud. And a former executive who was involved in the show's production was federally indicted for using an animation company as a vehicle for wire fraud through exactly the mechanism of artificial overhead and salary inflation that we've been talking about here. Now, each of these facts individually can be pretty mundanely explained, admittedly, right? Hollywood accounting is standard practice, and animation outsourcing is normal, and these absurd and bloated corporate structures can be pretty common in entertainment. And, even the continued production of the show that really nobody watches, nobody likes because it sucks now, it can be explained as, maybe it really is for catalog protection. That's a pretty rational business strategy. It could be real, right? But when you stack all of these things together and you see that the bones of a money laundering scheme, are present at every single stage of the operation here, I mean, come on, Look, do I, the great profit tax brass, peace be upon me, ultimately think The Simpsons is definitively confirmed for sure a money laundering scheme? I don't think there's enough hard evidence to make that claim with any level of certainty. If I had to bet my life on it, I'd probably say no, it's not primarily a money laundering operation. But, and this is a big but, like a short fat otaku-sized but, I think there is way more evidence for this theory than I expected when I started looking into it. That's just undeniable. Like, there's way more. I went in expecting to find nothing, and to make, a stupid fucking video. And instead, what I found is that there are North Korean animation studios tied to Western animation, there's federal wire fraud indictments tied to The Simpsons, there's Hollywood accounting schemes, and a really fucking bizarre contract law specifically for this show. So I really don't know what's going on. What I do know for sure is that I don't think the show is being kept around because of how great the new episodes are, alright? Lisa Simpson lecturing people about veganism and Marge telling me to vote for Kamala is not why Disney is writing the checks for this. It's not because it's really good and effective propaganda that everyone loves watching. It's probably being kept around primarily for the contract exclusivity reasons. The catalog is worth billions and the contract says you gotta keep making new episodes to keep it locked up, so, that does explain most of the weirdness. But wouldn't it be convenient if you were a corporate player that was already spending $100 million a year on a loss-leading production for contractual reasons, to then also use that production as a vehicle for some creative accounting? I mean, you're already spending the money. The infrastructure's already there. Why wouldn't you use it? What would stop you, really? And the answer might be because it's illegal, and Disney follows the law to the letter. Otherwise, they'd go to prison. It's possible. But something being illegal has never really stopped anyone in Hollywood before, right? This is the industry that covered for Harvey Weinstein for 30 years. Forgive me if I'm not brimming with confidence in their integrity here, okay? Really, I think the fact that this kind of thing is even possible is itself an indictment of the systems that allow for it. I mean, copyright law creates perverse incentives to produce unwanted content just to maintain control of a catalog. That's bad law, come on guys. All these regulations making it so that doing business is so complicated that laundering becomes feasible in the first place is a pretty grievous failure of policy, I should think, and I don't see why more people don't agree with me here. I would say the bare minimum takeaway is that the libertarian position on copyright law is yet again vindicated, because, the entire reason this bizarre apparatus exists in the first place is because the government-granted monopoly privileges over intellectual property, allow for it. If you didn't have the copyright regime that allows the corporation to quote-unquote own a cultural property for what is effectively forever, you wouldn't need these bizarre Rube Goldberg contractual structures. You wouldn't need to spend $100 million a year producing content that nobody watches just to maintain your monopoly over a catalog, which at a minimum people should agree is just money down the drain. Like, there's probably been over $1 billion spent on shitty Simpsons episodes written by Lisas now. That's not good use of wealth, and it's not what would happen in an actual free market. What should happen is that this content should enter the public domain, people should use it freely, and the artificial scarcity that makes all of this money laundering infrastructure potentially useful shouldn't really exist to begin with in the first place. But I'll save the copyright rant for another video. For now, just know that The Simpsons, it might not be a money laundering scheme. It could be, it could not be. I don't know. I don't have the power to check. And frankly, if I did have the power to check, I probably wouldn't check anyway because I don't want 3 bullets making a hidden Mickey in the back of my head, alright? Anyway, what do I know? I'm just a guy on YouTube who you should take seriously because I have a few thousand subscribers, and that makes me really trustworthy or something like that. Like and subscribe if you're so inclined. Thanks to all of the channel members whose names should be scrolling across the screen right now. Look at those guys. What great characters they are. Real fucking patriots. We call them RNs, actually. That's what we call them. Anyway, I've been Taxed Brass. Have a wonderful, wonderful day, everyone, and peace.